Hi everybody, I'm Scott Horton from antiwar.com, and by the looks of things, you're not going to be able to see me because, of course, all my test runs went great, but now that I'm going live, my camera is on the digital fritz. So, there you go. I guess that makes it a lot easier for me. It's just like doing a radio show. I can do that. Before, I was nervous. Alright, well, we're after the top of the hour, so I guess I'll go ahead and get started. I'm Scott Horton from Anti-War Radio. The website's antiwar.com/radio. And it's going to be hard to follow up, or I guess I should say Stefan Molyneux is a hard act to follow. Very interesting discussion there. But luckily I'm not talking about the same thing, so it won't feel too overshadowed by his awesome presence. So my speech today, or my talk today, is about central banking and war. And I'm afraid this is not very specific to anarchist libertarianism, agorism, and these kinds of things. You can draw your own connections. But of course all libertarians are anti-war. There are no exceptions to that. But you know, it was interesting to me that last time I tried to give this rap was at a speech in Santa Monica, I think at the beginning of December, and a very short clip of that ended up making a video. It was used in a video that Reason TV did about what happened to the anti-war movement. It's gone because everybody loves Barack Obama now and that kind of thing. At the very end of the thing, they included a clip of me talking about the Federal Reserve. And the example that they were making was that if you try to get libertarians to go to an anti-war thing, of course, they'll just make it all about the Federal Reserve, some wonky gold standard thing like that nobody cares about, which I guess makes me as bad as the Answer Coalition turning their anti-war rally into free Mumia Abu-Jamal or support government workers or, you know, anything but their topic. And the truth is, I guess that the guys at Reason have a point. If I'm going to show up at an anti-war rally and give a speech about central banking, then perhaps that excludes a lot of people who I ought to be trying to bring into my anti-war movement. But it seems to me that people who lean left pretty much already are anti-war, if not as passionately with a Democrat in the White House. And really it's people who at least think that they understand and believe in capitalism who need to be brought into the fold to try to get a bigger, stronger consensus in this country against the empire. And so, you know, I figure it's worth it to go ahead and explain my opposition to warfare in the context of America's economic crisis. And I guess I should say crises going all the way back. I think it's worth it, especially for people who think, or who have been led to believe up until now perhaps, that if you're pro-capitalism and property rights and those kinds of things, well then you're some kind of Republican and therefore support whatever war Republicans are lying into at any given time, that kind of thing. That's how most people are led to believe. So hopefully this will be an opportunity for you to see otherwise. Alright, so that was a long setup to tell you this. Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913. And basically what the Federal Reserve is it's the lender of last resort. It's a merger between all the big banks and the federal government, so that when the federal government needs money that they don't have, they can go to the Federal Reserve and borrow it. And when the banks need money that they don't have, or I guess want money that they don't have, they can basically just create it out of nothing with their reserve ratios. And the banks and the government protect each other. And of course, when government runs big debts, the Federal Reserve can buy that debt with new currency and dilute the value of the money. Now, I don't have time to go deep into it. I'm sure many of y'all are familiar with the Austrian theory of the business cycle. I would suggest you spend some time at Mises.org for one, if you want to understand a little bit more about it. But basically, the premise of, if I can tell it right, the premise of the Austrian theory of the business cycle is the opposite of what we all learn in school. what we all learn in school is that the excesses of laissez-faire free market capitalism in America, for example, caused a bunch of banking panics and eventually the Great Depression. And that so what we needed was this organized central regulatory and banking system in order to smooth out those booms and busts, the manias of the madness of the greedy capitalists in top hats. And so the Austrians say, nope, it's exactly the opposite. It's not capitalism. There's nothing inherent in capitalism that causes the business cycle, the boom and the bust. Yeah, there will be fads and there will be small bubbles here and there. But when it comes to answering the question of what causes a massive, as Mises called it, cluster of errors across the economy, what he says is the cause of that, the cause of great bubbles, and then the great poppings of those bubbles and the severe recessions that we suffer, is the injection, basically, of new bank credit, new money, by the Congress and the Federal Reserve, and by the banks working together. And basically what happens is, if you dump a bunch of new currency into certain industries, you'll see prices in those industries go up. You'll see bubble activity in those industries. So if Congress is spending a lot of money that they're borrowing, but regardless, if they're spending a lot of money buying weapons from Lockheed, well, then that creates an artificially high value in the stock of Lockheed, and for that matter, the metals that they use to build their weapons and that kind of thing. If the government has a big program to create ownership society by subsidizing and regulating the conditions of loans and things to try to get more and more people into houses, then the bubble will show up in the housing market. Somehow the stock market seems to always benefit the bubble and of course suffer too. So basically then the Austrian theory says that, and it's obviously complicated, I'm skipping a lot of steps, but the Austrians say that the bubble is the problem. The crash, the recession is the cure. The problem is creating artificial feeling or fervor, whatever, in the economy and convincing people by the low interest rates and so forth to invest in projects that turn out to not be worthwhile. And so it's creating the bubble in the first place that is the problem, and then the recession is the correction to that if you let the recession take hold. And of course our problem now, and really since the Great Depression, is that the so-called monetary scientists up there refuse to let a recession take hold. They always try to fight it by creating even more inflation to try to, of course, first and foremost, bail out their buddies who are already the richest and own all the biggest banks, but also because if the unemployment rate gets too high, people will start getting really mad, and they might start thinking of things that government ought to start spending less money on, such as, for example, war. And really, if you go back and look through the history of World War I and World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and maybe I can be a little bit more specific on the later stuff, what you'll see is time and time again a giant inflationary boom to coincide with the government waging the war. Because government can only raise taxes so much without really harming the economy in the short term and making a lot of people angry, getting themselves unelected. There's a certain limit on how much they can tax us, although these days you might not even know it. But so what they do instead is they just create the money out of nothing. And if you look at World War I, there was a giant inflationary bubble and then a terrible recession. They called it a depression back then, the Depression of 1921, and they called it that because it was over by 22, basically, because Andrew Mellon, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, said just let the bad debt settle and get prices back where they belong and then we'll be all right again, and he was right. That was the last time they basically let that happen. But then they created a giant bubble 27 through 29, particularly in the stock market, in order to prop up the British pound. They devalued the American dollar because they were overspending for their wars. And that's what created the giant stock market bubble that crashed in 29. And then you had stimulus, basically the 1970s program all through the 1930s, and it never worked. It never brought the American economy out of the Great Depression. It only prevented the correction from taking hold. And of course all the regime uncertainty from all the different programs and different regulations and experimentation by the government on the American economy just dragged things out worse and worse. But then in World War II, they basically were able to make it look like the economy is doing good because, first of all, they brought the unemployment rate way down by conscripting 16 million people, and of course, which reduced a lot of demand for goods here at home. But of course, they also had all kinds of rations and other restrictions. And they like to pretend that it was during World War II everybody got rich or something like that. But as Robert Higgs has shown in his book Depression, War, and Cold War, it was the end of the war and the end of many of the New Deal restrictions and regulations that finally allowed the American economy to recover. And in fact, I was just looking last night at the website of the St. Louis Federal Reserve Board, and they have all these great graphs and what have you. And they showed from 1950 to 1953 a big inflationary bubble and the lowering of the overnight interest rate from the Federal Reserve to the other banks and whatever to pay for the war in Korea, which of course was then followed by a recession after that. And then in the 1960s, you had Kennedy and Johnson were both big spenders, especially Johnson, war in Vietnam, and plus the Great Society, guns and butter thing here with domestic policy. And they lowered the interest rates and inflated the money supply and created a bubble basically to spend the money on the war for the cost of the war. And that bubble popped in 1968 or 69. And then from 1969 through 1979, I guess, right around there, 78, late 78, 79, they engaged in this very same Great Depression policy of continuing to try to stimulate the economy with deficit spending and with a loose monetary policy. And that led to, even if you're young like me, you at least have heard of the terrible economic conditions of the 1970s and the stagflation, which the Keynesians said was impossible, that you could have high inflation and high unemployment at the same time. And it was really a disaster. The oil prices, and of course everybody points their fingers at the Arabs and whatever, but they were just trying to get paid in dollars that were worth the same thing tomorrow as the day that they were getting them, and they were getting ripped off. So you saw the effects of the inflation all around in different places. And of course Nixon ended up putting on wage and price controls like Europe or something in order to try to prevent the effect of all the inflation. And in fact, he of course pushed for more and more inflation in 1972, which is the origin of the quote from Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, who said that, well, of course I inflate if the president wants me to inflate, otherwise I'll lose my independence. So, that's your answer when they say that the Federal Reserve must be independent from the politicians. It's certainly not. And then it wasn't until the very end of, I guess halfway through the Carter years, they brought in Paul Volcker, who was actually had helped engineer the abandoning of the gold standard completely, gold exchange standard in 1971, and who had really been the architect of a lot of the bad Federal Reserve policies. But apparently he learned a lesson from Hayek or somebody who's told him that no, we need to allow there to be a recession. Well, not only did he allow there to be a recession, he forced one. And he raised interest rates up to 20% at one point in order to not just allow prices to fall, but to force them to fall, to liquidate all the bad investments in the country and then some. And that laid fertile ground then finally for some real economic growth after decades of all this screwing around with the money and deficit spending in the 1980s, which of course they ran up pretty big deficits then as well to pay for Ronald Reagan's arms expansion. I think it was a $4 trillion debt by the time he left office. And then with the fall of the Soviet Union, George Bush, I think the journalist Robert Perry really makes this case the best. He says the real purpose, the overriding goal of the first Gulf War was to beat Vietnam syndrome. That was the American people's unwillingness to wage imperial wars around the world forever, because they got burned in Vietnam. Their friends died in Vietnam. And so they got the Vietnam syndrome, this illness in the minds of the American elite that made them want to not wage war. Well, once the Soviet Union was out of the way, even neoconservatives like Gene Kirkpatrick were saying, now we can be a normal country in a normal time. Now we can have our peace dividend. The Warsaw Pact is gone. Now NATO can be gone. We can bring our troops home. And I just think of that, a normal country in a normal time. Not sure exactly what that means, but certainly it isn't what we've had since then. And what they did was they waged Operation Yellow Ribbon in 1991 in order to beat Vietnam syndrome and erase from the mind of the American people the idea that they really deserved what they had been promised through those decades of Cold War, the peace dividend, that we could finally dismantle our military, cut all this spending, and keep this money and use it to improve our lives and what have you. And they were able to do that, especially once Bill Clinton took office. I mean, the recession was pretty much over by the time he took office anyway. It was ending by the time he took office, the Gulf War recession. They had created a bubble for that one too. But then they created a massive bubble, and there was all kinds of real economic expansion and growth that helped mask a lot of this inflation in the 1990s. And plus a lot of pressure on the Saudis to keep overproducing, keep that oil price really low through the 1990s was really helpful as well. And then that led to the economic bubble that was used to basically disguise the expansion of the American empire in what was, ostensibly peacetime, the perpetual bombing of Iraq and a few choice wars in Africa and the Balkans notwithstanding. Basically, and also for that matter, a lot of the deindustrialization of the United States took place because during this giant economic bubble, it seemed like the right thing to do. The economic indicators made sense in that bubble time for a lot of that to happen as well. And so, but then we all know the story. At the end of '99, the NASDAQ bubble popped. Beginning of 2000, the rest of the stock market fell completely kaput. And then you had, right in there, you had Y2K, which had Alan Greenspan creating tons of new cash and putting tons of new cash money into circulation so that all the ATMs would be stocked to avoid banking panics. Because the bank doesn't have your money. They loaned it out and then some. And so we got to prevent those panics by making sure there's enough paper for people to go and get. And then when George Bush took power, he called it the Clinton recession, and he was right. He wanted to make sure that he didn't get the blame for the recession. But of course then September 11th happened on his watch, and it not only hit a major industry like the airlines were actually crashed into the financial district in Manhattan. And so the stock market was closed for, a couple of weeks or something, and there were all kind of damage to major corporations and uncounted billions of dollars, hundreds probably of billions of dollars lost in the September 11th attack, maybe trillions of dollars worth of, in the seen and the unseen, what could have been if it hadn't been for just that attack, never mind the response from it. It cost the American country, our society, a lot. And we were already overdue for a recession anyway, or they had short-circuited the recession with all the stimulus, and with the deliberate attempt, you could call it an open conspiracy between Paul Krugman, Alan Greenspan, and George Bush to reinflate the bubble, this time in housing, in order to prevent that double dip recession, in order to prevent prices from actually making the correction that they needed to correct. So then when September 11th happened, we meaning the country, the society here, the economy in America, was overdue. We needed a severe recession then. It was just the natural course of events. And in order to short-circuit that, they put the printing presses on full blast. They lowered interest rates down to 1% over the space of a couple of months, and kept them that way through almost the end of 2004. And the reason that they did that is because they wanted not just a war in Afghanistan, not just a mission to hunt down Ayman al-Zawahiri and Osama bin Laden. They wanted a regime change and a permanent occupation there, and then they wanted their bonus war, at least, in Iraq. And they had to make all of this seem like it was free, to make it seem like it was being done on the cheap. They know that we all believe World War II was good for saving us from the Great Depression or whatever, so we already have, the whole country believes that, has this kind of false understanding for them to build off of. But then if they send us stimulus checks in the mail and tell us all we got to do to keep making money is to keep spending money and we'll keep the economy going, it seemed right. Everybody's getting flat screen TVs, they're refinancing their houses all the time and cashing in. And during a time of despair, a time of massive military operations around the globe, and you can hear Democrats complaining, we're not being asked to sacrifice. Because, of course, that's the highest value, is sacrificing for the state to a Democrat. But they sort of had a point, from a certain point of view, that they were basically telling us this is free. Not only that, here's a stimulus check in the mail for $300, and we're all making money. And you think about it, George Bush almost got away with it. George Bush left office 3 months after the stock market crash. He almost got out of office before that thing finally fell completely apart. And then, so now we have, 5 wars waging, now 6. And we have, not just a Republican imperialist president, but a Democratic imperialist president who is, far worse than Bush on the question of belief in Keynesian economics. I mean, Bush probably was being led around by a bunch of Milton Friedmanite types, at worst. And the stimulus checks, more or less go along with that. But Barack Obama is just surrounded completely by these Keynesians who are convincing him, and did convince him, what we need is a $6 trillion budget. We have got to fill up that hole in the economy with deficit spending. And, of course, we have to rack up these huge debts. We're now at a $14 trillion national debt. We have the Federal Reserve creating trillions of dollars out of nothing to bail out the banks that got themselves all caught up in the fraud in the last bubble and had to be bailed out, and that goes for banks all over the world as well as Americans. And they've created this QE1 and QE2, and they're basically they quit counting the M3 money supply numbers, but they keep going off of the, basically jacking them through the roof. Whoever's counting real M3 is watching, tens of trillions of dollars of bad debts being liquidated. Still the money supply goes up and up and up. And so now look where we are. All across the Middle East, the people are in revolt. And it's not radical Islam. It's not Marxism. Hell, I'm not so sure it's even really democracy, although I'm sure they would all like to have fair trials and an end to torture and military dictatorships and kingdoms. We're Americans. What do we think about living under a king? Right? Well, that's how they feel too. But you know what it's really about? They can't afford to put food on their families. That's what it's about. And the reason they can't is because of George Bush, and because of Barack Obama, and because of the American empire, and because of all the new money that's been created to pay for this massive global terror war. And hell, the expense of propping up their dictatorships that they suffer under. And because since World War II, the American dollar has basically been the default gold standard, that means that a great many financial transactions between states and between giant corporations in different states and so forth are denominated in dollars, especially oil and food. And so in order to buy for example, Egypt, in order for them to import 2/3 of their food supply, much of it from the United States, they have to buy that grain with American dollars. And so what's happening is, even though we are seeing our gas prices rise, our food prices rise, and numerous indicators of pretty bad inflation across our society here, we are exporting much of that inflation to the rest of the world. And so what happens when you have, what happens when you have people who live on $2 a day, and now their $2 is only worth 75 cents? Their kids are starving. Now they're pissed. And now they revolt. And so the American empire has simply sown the seeds of its own destruction here. They had to, and in fact, there are some who say that the threat that Saddam Hussein was going to just start using euros and yen to denominate his oil purchases was one of the main motivations for invading and attacking that country, to not let him do that, to set the precedent that that others could make these giant exchanges in oil and other goods in currencies other than dollars. They needed to keep that mindset going so they could keep making that money. So here they created trillions of dollars. They created a massive bubble. They dislocated the entire world economy. And now they've made it where the average peasant in our puppet dictatorships in the Middle East cannot even afford the basic amount of food that they used to be able to keep their family alive. And so now the whole Middle East is rising up. Many of them, I don't know who was it who said, one of these probably great Austrian economists who said, not one man in 1,000 understands inflation. They know the prices rise, they don't really know whose fault it is, but usually they just point at the nearest politician and blame him, which is, of course, can be very problematic, because then you get price controls and shortages and riots and worse problems from there. But anyway, so the point of this is, ultimately, the bottom line is, these wars are incredibly expensive. They cannot raise your taxes too high without you revolting. They cannot create a world empire and make you pay for it without somehow disguising it with some smoke and some mirrors to make it seem like it's mostly free. As our society's going broke now, we can see in the poll numbers, people really more and more are starting to question the cost of all this militarism. And that's, come on, we live in a society where the vast majority of people are made to believe that our military is keeping the entire world at bay. They all want to kill us all day long just because of how good we are. We need to occupy the whole world. We're scared of Iran, Libya, Zimbabwe, you name it. Who do we bomb? We'll bomb them. That's the mindset of most Americans. And yet even then, they're, especially with Ron Paul on TV repeating it every day, day after day in their ear, they're starting to get the idea that spending trillions of dollars a year on this empire is causing us these problems. And I'm sorry, I skipped the part about. And so when they create that money to pay for those wars, that creates, it's not just that they're stealing the corners off of the dollars in your wallet and pickpocketing you a little bit at a time so you don't know, but they also create these massive distortions, these booms and busts, that then of course convince everyone else that freedom is bad and what we need is more government regulation and what have you. So, the bad news is that if they have to, I believe that the people who run America now will, the empire, if nothing but the generals, the Federal Reserve Board, the U.S. Senate, these people spend every last dime we have. They'll inflate away every last dime we have if they have to in order to prop up this world empire. They believe in it. This is the future of the world in their eyes. And this madness was launching a brand new long-term intervention in Libya just in the last week ought to be proof of, what it is that the people in Washington, D.C. really think about what they are capable of at your expense. And there's not a Congress full of Ron Pauls up there. They're not about to get their priorities straight, and America's in for some real hard times, especially if, as predicted by many of these Austrian economists, the bond bubble really breaks and people across the world really, now big countries, nation states are already abandoning the dollar. The Russians and the Chinese are abandoning the dollar. They're trying to work out a new kind of IMF market basket of currencies or whatever. And yeah, that's what the Keynesians always wanted and that kind of thing. But it's also because we're basically giving them no choice. Our government is ripping off the world by buying things with these depreciating dollars, and they are being, we're forcing them out of our orbit. And since we shouldn't be an empire in the first place, I guess in a sense that's to the good. But I think it's going to be a while before we see our troops come home. But I'm a libertarian anarchist. I don't think that we need to have a state to do a single thing for us. I ran out of excuses for them a long, long time ago. But as we move into this new era, this brave new world, from here on out, I think you're going to see more and more the poorest and the weakest among us, minority groups, and Muslims and Mexican immigrants and whoever, everyone, black single mothers, everyone will be the cause of our problem, except the people who have all the power. Because we have a lot of problems now, they're going to get worse. And so I think it's very incumbent upon those of us who really do understand how it is we get into these messes, and how it is that the people in Washington, D.C. are the ones getting us into these messes, to especially take note of that and counteract that, and defend the weak from the demagoguery. Be smart with your hatred. Aim up at your targets, at the people who really have the power and are the ones who deserve it. Anyway, that's probably not the best talk on central banking and war I ever gave, but it was more or less my best. So I guess we'll turn it over to questions now. If anybody wants me to try to clarify anything. Oh, I want to say one more thing, which is read Ron Paul, Robert Higgs, Robert Murphy, Tom Woods, and G. Edward Griffin. And of course, look at Mises.org. J.O. Griffin's book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. That's how I got into this central banking and war mess back when I was in high school a long, long time ago. And the rest of these guys have been of great help to me. I knew it was a housing bubble all along, from the year 2000 on. And you know why? Ron Paul giving speeches on the floor of the U.S. House. Ron Paul articles at LouRockwell.com. Simple as that. All right, so any questions? I got the chat room open here at the Agora.io channel, Peaceful Evolution channel. Anybody ask me whatever you want if you want. And thanks for listening. What ANCAP businesses do you suggest to monetarily outcompete the warlords? Well, I think ultimately anything that you're doing as far as trying to operate in an underground, untaxed economy, using currencies that they can't depreciate the value out from under you, that kind of thing. It's small ripples in the pond. But hell, we don't have really a private military that we can hire instead. Of course, Blackwater and all that, those are just creatures of the Pentagon. That's not the free market. When it comes to cops, I think, the more private security people have, the less, so-called public security, government police they need. And so, it's a really good thing to see people hiring private security services, ADT and Burns and Stanley Smith Security, things like that. I don't know that we really have those kind of alternatives when it comes to matters of foreign policy, but it's an interesting question. I guess I should try to think on that more. I think, probably the most important thing is, well, it's all supply and demand, right? Even if we're talking about government. If you continue to demand security services from the state, then they will continue to pretend to simply be answering your call, So I think, the very first order of business of all libertarians should be the delegitimization of the state, the complete end of the presumption of legitimacy that they enjoy. That's what needs to be taken over. Next time they promise us they're going to go invade somebody to help them, we all just don't believe it anymore. You know, I think that's really the best we can do. All right, so let's see here. Scott, do you think that Libya and Egypt will expand into Bush's 7-nation plan? Well, I don't know. I mean, his 7 nations were Syria and Iran, and there's news in Syria. There's a huge protest movement in the south of Syria, and the Syrian government has been shooting them lately. And of course, Robert Gates in Israel 2 days ago said that, well, you know, the Syrians, not the Saudis, not the king of Bahrain, not the president of Yemen, not the king of Jordan, not the dictators in Algeria, Morocco, but in Syria. They ought to take a lesson from what's going on in Egypt, and the military ought to stand out of the way and let the people overthrow Assad. And I'm wondering whether this isn't the most obvious thing in the whole world, more obvious than the color blue in the sky. That America supports revolutions in countries in the Middle East where we don't already support the dictatorship. And if we do, it's the very last thing we want. Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton did everything they could to shore up Mubarak's position. And then when it was clear that Mubarak was going to have to leave Egypt, they made no secret even. They have no shame in D.C. anymore. They don't even lie. They just admit exactly their most heinous plans. Well, we want to hire as Mubarak's replacement Omar Suleiman, the head of their secret torture police. Kids in the street holding up tear gas canisters saying "Made in the USA" on them. In Tunisia, they supported Ben Ali. They didn't want to see him go, but I don't know that they really knew or thought they could do too much about it. But in Bahrain, America supports King Hamad. Why? Because that's where we base our 5th Fleet. And yeah, they'll say the most non-committal criticisms. Well, you know, we'd like to see, you know, less violence in Bahrain. Jon Stewart, in fact, played a clip of one of the State Department spokesmen saying, well, we want people on all sides in Bahrain to engage in restraint. And Jon Stewart joked that, yeah, you know, the military shooting all those people in Pearl Square, they should restrain themselves and not shoot so much. And the protesters getting shot, well, they should stay out of the way of those bullets. Restrain yourselves with your peaceful protesting. That's because America's on the side of the king of Bahrain. And when the Saudis wanted to invade the place, the Americans said, okay, but just for a couple of days, have the Arab League ask us to invade Libya. We need a little bit of cover, a little bit of pressure from below. We need you to be the demand so we can be the supply. Saudis ask us to regime change Libya. And so here we are. And the Saudis said, all right, but we're sending our tanks into Bahrain. And apparently Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton said, go right ahead. So, again, oh, and, you know, Gaddafi is actually kind of a halfway, right? Gaddafi actually was, you know, a rogue guy for a long, long time. And Bush's original list of the countries he wanted to regime change included Libya. But then after the Iraq War, they let Gaddafi come back in from the cold, turn over some garage sale junk, centrifuge parts he'd bought from AQ Khan on the black market, and anybody can read the Associated Press all about the West, and particularly Britain and the United States, military support for Muammar Gaddafi from 2003 to 11. But then again, he wasn't that close. He was basically the new guy. He was no Hosni Mubarak. And the American people still have leftover Bomb Gaddafi shirts in their closet from 1984, and fittingly, and can remember, I guess it was 86, and they can remember hating him. He's a guy we love to hate, a good Osama, Saddam Hussein 2 minutes hate type figure. And so they figured, I think, that they can make a new full-scale beachhead in Africa for the next 100 years of war, and they can, at the same time, change the subject from, wow, look, the entire Middle East is rising up against their American-backed military dictators and kings, to, look, America is the good guy coming to save the civilian rebel protesters from their evil dictator, and confuse the clear truth, the obvious narrative, which of course is playing everywhere else in the rest of the world, certainly, which is that all these revolutions are against our dictators, and that the USA is the bad guy in each and every one of these. And what I think specifically about Libya is that once you say that we have to protect the civilians there, then that means you can't leave until Gaddafi's gone. He can't win now, can he? Because if he wins in those civilians, that means having a monopoly on the right to use aggression within that territory, right? They can't let him win, or he will be attacking those very people who are rising up against him. So now they have to at least split the country back into two, like it was back before World War II, or perhaps roll all the way into Tripoli. In either case, they're going to have to set up a new democratic government, they'll call it, train up a new army, and if the UN resolution says no army of occupation, that's fine. We'll just send in an army of liberation instead. We won't use the army. We'll use the Marine Corps of occupation. And I'm telling you, unless Barack Obama can get up there, or unless the House and Senate impeach him or remove him from office, or if he could get up there and say, you know what, I totally screwed up, screw them, let the Libyans burn, I'm bringing the troops home, and forget all that stuff I said about pretending to love them and whatever, which he can't do, then we're going to have a war there for the rest of Obama's 8 years in office. Alright, let's see what time is it. I think we've got time for one more. Try to keep my answer short. If anybody had a new question, I'm looking at the chat room here. Let's see if I can page down. I probably missed some. Yeah, alright, so this thing's kind of weird. It's not working very well. I don't know. If anybody has any more questions, how do you see Hugo Chavez style statism as opposed to American statism? Oh, I'm sorry, I could not, my chat room screwed up and I was not able to read the rest of that. Oh, here we go. Are they such big enemies as the mainstream media portrays? Is the empire likely to invade Venezuela? Possibly. The coup d'etat against Venezuela in 2002 was because Muammar Gaddafi was overheard by the National Security Agency on the phone with Saddam Hussein, saying, hey, let's jack with the oil price, and raised it up. And according to Greg Palast's work, and he was there at the time, this conspiracy, this plot to manipulate the oil price between Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein was the cause for the attempted coup d'etat in Venezuela, which I think is actually maybe a fight between different oil companies, because I know that there are some Houston oil companies that get along just fine with Hugo Chavez. I think it's much more a state problem with him. He doesn't have any problem doing business with Houston. He did take $20 billion out of the Federal Reserve, and he did make himself the little IMF of South America, where other developing countries down there could get loans without being exploited, without just having everything, having those loans used as an excuse to rob them blind of all their assets and whatever, but just honest business, completely cutting out the IMF and World Bank from screwing around in South America. So made him some enemies there. But is he a threat to the United States in any way? No. Is he a threat to the people of Venezuela? I don't know. I mean, on an individual one-on-one basis, yeah, but no worse than the American police state. Certainly not. And he certainly has no military force to do anything other than perhaps defend himself from America's allies in Colombia, were it to ever come to a conflict there. And like I say, he's got good relations with the oil men. They don't have any call for regime change there, I don't think. Although that could be a matter of which oil companies he's in with and which oil companies are tighter with whoever happens to be in power now. I'd have to delve further into that. But is Venezuela a threat in any way to the United States? Is Hugo Chavez, an outright communist dictator, something the way that they portray him? No. I mean, is he scum? Yeah, he's the head of state. Does he kill people and shut down opposition media and whatever? Of course. Is he going to try to stay in office until he's 85 years old? Then, yeah, he is. But does that make him any kind of danger? Certainly less than his friend Muammar Gaddafi, who was not one at all. And let's see here. My little chat thing is screwing up, so I don't know if I'm supposed to cut it off now or if I was supposed to go till like 10 till, or how exactly it works. But I guess I'll just go ahead and let y'all know that I keep the archives of all the interviews I've done since 2003 at scotthortonshow.com. If you click on all interviews there's more than 1,700 of them going back to 2003. Of course, antiwar.com/radio. You can be my friend on Facebook or whatever like that. My blog is thestressblog.com, and my show is on the Liberty Radio Network every Monday through Friday from noon to 3 East Coast time. That's LRN.FM for that. And I guess that's pretty much all I've got to say about that. Thank you all very much for listening. I'm sorry that there was no video, although it made it a lot easier on me, kinda. But thanks very much, and have a great rest of your Agorist conference.